For the next session, itself, we'll be inviting Rahul Daswani, Head of Partnerships from Open Government Products. Rahul will actually be sharing the origins, vision, and strategy of Open Government Products and how it has accelerated the digital transformation of the Singapore government. Without further ado, Rahul, please.
Justin. Cool. Before I start, I just want to get a feel for who's in the room here. So, how many of you are students? Raise your hands. Okay, about quite a few, about almost half people. How many of you are working in the tech space? Okay, quite a lot of people. Anybody wanting to work in the tech space and that's why you're here but you're not currently working? Okay, a few people. Cool. So hopefully what I'm going to be sharing is going to be useful to all of you. First and foremost, who and what is Open Government Products? So we're a division of GovTech, but we're specifically been designated an experimental unit. The whole idea is to answer the question, what if the government actually operated like a modern tech startup? And not like the traditional sort of bureaucratic way that you might be used to expecting from the government. What would that look like? And so our team set out 3 years ago to answer that question. So what's happened since then in those last 3 years? Why do we exist? As you know, I'm sure all of y'all are familiar with the Smart Nation idea and Singapore getting there, but how can we do so with this kind of tech crunch, talent crunch that we're facing in the tech sector? So how do we compete? How do we make sure that we're relevant? Because otherwise, we're never going to fulfill these goals that we have of being a smart nation. Who are we? We're a team of primarily engineers, product designers, and product managers who build a bunch of tech products. You will be familiar with certainly some of them. So if anybody took your vaccination, vaccine.gov.sg, we built that in a 2-week period very quickly. If you have downloaded Scamshield, then you would be protected from some SMSs and calls. My colleague Palani will be talking right after that about Redeem, which is the voucher system. So if you have CDC vouchers, which you use to buy food from the government, though, that was also built by us, and Palani will be talking a lot more about that later on. We also have a bunch of products that are more for government officers to have better relationships and be able to communicate with the public better. So Isomer is a website template generator. So anybody without a code background can actually build a website. Postman is the engine that powers the gov.sg, Telegram, and WhatsApp. So if you got the daily updates on COVID, that was powered by a product called Postman, which now allows government people to send communication by email, SMS, or even Telegram to a set of people. So these are kind of a set of products that we have, both for government and public. Lots of we built them very fast. They have lots of impact, as you can imagine. So that's what we did so far in the last 3 years. Just to give you a kind of a sample of both the reliability of our product. So Isomer website, as I told you, is a website generator, 100 times less downtime than typical website. The cost is also way lower, and the way that we do that is by using a lot of off-the-shelf existing SaaS solutions. So we don't build a lot of things that already exist. The whole idea is we want to build as little as possible. And that way you take advantage of the economies of scale and the security services that are provided, and you achieve wonderful outcomes for everybody, and we use lots less taxpayers' money than we need to. So that's cool. Just a sampling of the range of products also during COVID. I mentioned the vaccination products, but also if you remember, we scaled up very dramatically our cases from tens of cases to thousands of cases. And so it became very hard to track each person who had COVID. And then there was a lot of confusion around who's eligible for Protocol 2 and self-recovery at home. So we used a case management solution. And again, the whole idea of not building everything from scratch, we use a existing case management system called Zendesk and allowed MOH to then help people and get information once rather than multiple times as the person was passed through agency to agency. We built Homer, which is a self-reporting tool for people on quarantine. So to make sure that you're actually at the place of your quarantine and not away, it allows you to self-report your location. So we built that as well. And then we built the ART registration form. And the data that we collected then formed the basis, and we shared it with some of these applications that you'll be familiar with. Okay, so basically lots of cool products, built them very fast, quite cheap and pretty reliable. So you might ask, okay, you guys did that really well, but did that come at the cost of people being burnt out? Right? Because that is a lot of what happened last year. So we recently, this is what people at OGP said in an anonymous survey. Okay, people said, yeah, it's a great place to work. I feel happy and I feel that I'm given a lot of responsibility. Right, an anonymous survey. That's what we said. Why did this happen? So if you look at last year, many of you may not know this. Last year was actually the worst year for the public service in 2 decades in terms of attrition. Okay, 10% of the public service left, quit the jobs. Never happened in 20 years. Right? And when we asked people why this is happening, they gave us 3 reasons. They said, one, well, I don't feel like my mental, physical, emotional well-being is in order, and so I actually have to leave. The second is, well, I'm not getting the kind of growth and development that I want. I'm not advancing in my competencies, in my skills, and kind of impact that I can have, so I'm leaving. And 3, I don't feel like the organization is agile enough to be able to respond to what the situation needs at any given time. Right? So that's actually why people left. And instead, at OGP, what happened is we saw fairly flat happiness. Yeah, we weren't like thrilled because a lot of COVID products, but we managed to keep the baseline moving. We had people join us rather than leave. In fact, 2 people who left to Grab and TikTok came back within 10 months because actually because of the same reasons. They felt like they weren't growing in those places and they had a better growth trajectory here and they had a better ability to make an impact nationally than at these places. So they came back to OGP. So we grew quite a lot in the last year. And the people who left actually left to get really, really senior and really, really cool positions because they wanted more regional or global experience. Right, and most of the people who left had been at OGP for 3 to 5 years actually. So it's bound to happen that people leave, and I think that's okay. Actually, I'm happy for the permeability across the private and the public sector. I hope that increases rather than decreases in the future. Right, so that's what happened to us. So I told you that there are 3 factors, right? So this is kind of well-being, growth and development. Sorry, then growth or development. Actually, we conduct a pulse survey every 2 weeks. You ask a series of questions and you answer multiple choice. And in general, people say, okay, yes, great. I actually feel like I'm growing at OGP. And then finally, we do resourcing on a quarterly basis. This is just a chart to show you that actually every quarter things can change in terms of where you're staffed on what project. Things change quite rapidly. And so that idea of is an organization able to keep up with what the needs are quickly enough, we actually change. And so you would see all these people who are on different products. Well, at Postman, when 2021 came by and we knew that COVID was a priority, we just moved them all to COVID and making sure that we built the vaccination system as quickly as possible. And we can only do that because we take fairly bold and quick decisions to change, to move people for wherever impact is prioritized. Okay, so that's a brief introduction of what we've done. What is our mission? So I told you we're an experimental unit. So the whole idea is to experiment in 2 things. One, how do we build technology differently? How do we have an agile organization, build different products? But also, how do we run the organization well and differently? How do we get people from places like Zendesk and Google and Facebook to join us? How do we make sure that they are developing? How do we make sure that we take care of their well-being emotionally and physically? And once we experiment and we find practices that work, let's document them, right? Let's demonstrate that they work and document them in a really extensive way so that we can propagate them, so that other parts of the public service, of the government, for now the Singapore government, but I don't think there's any reason why the practices that we've developed and learned can't be used by any organization in the private sector or even other governments across the world. So because we're being paid by Singapore taxpayers, of course, we're going to focus for now on the Singapore government, but we're also open sourcing a lot of our practices because we've learned so much from the open source community. Many of our practices are not derived from scratch, but instead adapted from existing practices from some of these larger companies that you will know of, like Facebook and Google and Apple, but also modern startups like Lazada or Circles Life that we've really adapted their practices from. And because we've learned from so many such companies, we're actually happy to give back to the community, and we've developed guides, which I'll share with you at the end of this presentation, to say, hey, actually, if any of you want to take these to your future companies or your current companies, actually feel free to do what you want with these guides. Okay, but this is our mission. How do we operate? Maximize the impact on public good. So that's how we can change our resourcing quite quickly, because if we determine that there's a big change in what is going to affect public good, let's then change our resources. Let's focus on that. Treat people fairly and communicate openly. So specific examples of those are salaries at each level for each role are basically public within OGP. So if you're OGP and you would know exactly how much a software engineer earns, a senior software engineer earns, a product manager, a lead product manager, a designer, a corporate staff, you would know how much each of these persons earns to the dollar, actually. And in order to treat people fairly and avoid any kind of bias like gender bias or racial bias, for example, if you're at the same level for the same role, you will be paid exactly the same amount of money. There is no salary range at OGP. There are only salary points. So every senior software engineer will be paid exactly the same amount of money. If you outperform, obviously you get a bonus depending on how much you're outperforming, but your base salary is exactly the same. And so the only factor then we pay attention to is what is your level, and the only factor you need to pay attention to as an employee is what is the current level that I'm performing at. Right? So that's how those are some examples of how we treat people fairly and communicate openly, empower people to make good decisions. The average age of an OGP employee currently is 27 years old. Okay, these are people working on national level projects. Okay, the only way we can do that is by empowering them to make sure that they are responsible for the problem and not being micromanaged. They are the ones who go talk to users, find out what users need, and then suggest what the product should be like and what the features should be prioritized. Do whatever needs doing. So just because you're an engineer, it doesn't mean you don't get involved with discussions with and unblocking other government agencies, for example. Or just because you're a product manager, you need to then figure out what needs to be done. If a designer is unable to help you, then who's from the team is going to step up and do some of the user research. So this is a very startup kind of mindset. Do whatever you need to do. And finally, help each other impact. The goal is impact as a team. It's not about any one individual. So that's the goal. There are 4 things that I want to cover in the next 10 minutes that I think are the keys to our success as an organization. 1, resourcing. 2, hiring. 3, development. And 4, integrated teams. So resourcing. 3 principles for resourcing. 1, staff based on greatest potential for public good. I talked about this already. So if we see a big potential, and we actually run our own hackathon every January for a month. And the whole idea is then let's talk to citizens, let's talk to government officers and figure out what problems exist now. And based on those problems, let's build a prototype by the end of Jan. And then based on which of these can affect the greatest public good, let's make sure that those products are the ones that are resourced. So Postman, the engine that powers the Gov.sg WhatsApp, was an example of this. So was Homer. Go.gov.sg, which is a link shortener that prevents phishing because only government officers can create Go.gov.sg links, was also a hackathon product. 70% of products are actually hackathon products. Start small. So the whole idea is don't just fund a multi-million-dollar project off the bat. You want to build something small. You want to build a prototype first. See if it's actually solving this problem it's supposed to solve. See if that's actually the problem that needs solving, which sometimes only happens at a prototype. And then after that, once that is ascertained, then you go on and put in more resources. So don't put in too many resources in the beginning. And finally, I think one thing that large organizations fall into the trap of doing is feel like this is going to be my really, really core product. And so if it's not working, what do? Put in more money and more people to make it successful. Actually, we think you should do the opposite. If your product, for whatever reason, is not working, is not getting traction, kill it. It's not working. Instead, redeploy those resources to successful teams, because those people have established that they're able to identify good problems, make a good product. So why don't you give them the resources and let them figure out what the next thing is to be built, which is quite counter to how a lot of large organizations as you scale operate. So I really think it's worth rethinking that, both in government and outside. In practice, what does this look like? So I talked about our quarterly distribution of resources, but also one of the things with this whole idea of we don't think management always has a 360 view and knows everything. We don't operate on the principle. So then how do you optimize an organization when you don't believe that management necessarily knows what's best? So you say, okay, as an organization, we think we know roughly 2/3 of what the best things to do out there for public good. So we control 2/3 of your time as employees. I'll tell you what to do for 2/3 of your time. Now, with the 1/3 of your time, you decide what you're going to do. If you decide to compound that and do the same thing that I told you to do for 2/3 of the time, that's fine because we've already established as an organization priority. If instead, though, you say, actually, no, I think there's something else that you have not focused on that is worth my time, there are groups of people who collaborate and build stuff with their 1/3 time. Quick example of this is Check First, an eligibility checker. So this is, you might be eligible for, typically when people write policies and post them on the internet, they are policy centric, which means you have to read the whole freaking policy and decide, do I fit in here? Do I fit in here? No. Do I qualify for this? Yes or no? Instead, what would it look like if you were user-centric? Well, I key in my details and you tell me what I'm eligible for, right? I'm eligible for this subsidy, I'm eligible for this grant based on the criteria that I put in. It's way better as a user experience. So a group of people said, hey, actually, this is something that we want to build, that even though there isn't a very concrete use case, let's build this eligibility tracker because it could be used, this checker because it could be useful. And it became really useful first in COVID when we talked about this protocol too, because the policies were changing very regularly. And so people didn't know, am I eligible to recover at home, or do I have to go get myself checked, or do I have to go quarantine? And so by using this eligibility checker, it was much easier for people to determine that rather than saying, hey, I'm not sure because the policies are changing so quickly whether they should be helpful. So that's everybody's prerogative the whole year round. Okay, so that's how we work. And what's great about this is then people tend to identify really cool projects or really cool products that have a lot of impact that weren't identified by management. Right? And while you still have control and you make sure you deliver on some of the key pieces that you're promising to your stakeholders. Right? And so I talked about this. This is kind of like, these are products. This is the idea of 2/3 time and this is the idea of 1/3 time. So people kind of decide, we decide the 2/3 and then people kind of assign themselves their 1/3 time. And we change this up every quarter. It's Excel sheets. We're pretty scrappy. We just use Excel sheet, let people go in on Google Drive and change whatever they need to change, right? You don't need complex systems sometimes. If simple systems work for you in a small organization, it works fine for us. So, like I said earlier, we managed to hire quite a lot of cool people from a bunch of places. How exactly did we do that? We did that because we're really fast. People in this market actually want offers really fast, and they kind of get annoyed if you take too long. And so as a small organization, one of the things that you can do better than large organizations is be fast. Because you have less people to interview, your process can be a lot faster. And there are people who have turned down offers from places like Google and Facebook because they're now so large and there's so many rounds that their offers come much more slowly than our offers. Right? So that's one of the advantages. How do you be fast though? You need clarity first on so first of all, we reach out to people. We go out and source. People are not going to come to an organization that they don't really know about that often. So we have sources. We actually use freelancers on Fiverr that we go to find profiles of people who might be good fit for OGP. And then we have the hiring manager, so like the engineering manager, the product manager, the lead product manager will go and message these people on LinkedIn and say, hey, OGP is super cool organization. We think you'd be great here. Why don't you have a chat with us? Right? And actually the rate of conversion for the people who apply for this and their success to offer is much higher than a random person applying, right? Which should be the case if you're sourcing properly. Right? So like 70% of people make it here as opposed to like 5% of people who actually make it all the way through. So that's one thing that we do to be pretty aggressive there. We want to have automated screenings so that you don't spend a lot of time filtering out people who are just not going to make the cut at all. And the idea here is to it's kind of a hygiene check. It's just like, do you have the basic skills that you need for the job? It's not like, are you the best? It's just, are you good enough to come for an interview and take up 2 hours of our engineer's time to interview you or not? All right, so we do that. And then finally, the interview. And I think what I want to say here at the interview stage is you need to be really, really clear about what you're interviewing for. So at OGPU, there are 4 big things that we interview for, and it's very clear that we're interviewing for those 4. 1, technical ability, and this is regardless of job type. Do you have the ability to do that specific role well? That has to be defined pretty well in terms of competency, so we would test for those both through behavioral questions, but also through a case study. Do you have that really well? Number 2, communication. You're going to have to communicate with people who are different from you. So if you're an engineer, you're going to communicate with UX designers, with product managers, with the corporate team, and vice versa. So can you communicate what you're trying to say in layman's or other language than besides technical language? 3, initiative. Are you self-motivated, self-driven? Because otherwise this whole 2/3, 1/3 thing is not going to work out very well. If you're going to be waiting for people to assign you work, that's not going to work well in our organization. So have you demonstrated that you're going to figure out what's going on, what needs to be done, and then jump in and get that done? And so we test for that. And 4, values. Are you committed to public good? Because that's really what we're about. We're about using technology for public good. So if are you committed to that? And if not, then this is not necessarily the right place for you. So that's what our interviews test for. And because we're so clear about what we're testing for and what that looks like, it's much easier for us to come to a consensus or a decision around hiring. And then you get an offer. And our offer, unlike some other places, we don't just give a verbal offer and then say wait, a bunch of time for the details. We're like, here's the offer, and that's the other advantage of doing salary points. Is like here's the exact role, therefore everything flows from that. The offer, the base salary flows from that, the possible bonuses flow from that. So it's actually really easy for us once we determine that we're going to offer somebody at a particular level. It's almost instantaneous that we can generate the quantitative or the written offer for them. So that's also really, really helpful, and we get that going. Third, performance management. I think I'm going to run out of time pretty soon. So I'm going to highlight the key points from performance management that I think is different from the rest of the government, but actually not so different from some of the better tech companies out there. Number 1, we do a 360 review. So you're going to be rated by at least 7 of your peers. Right, and we do a confidence weighted one. The different colors, the darker the color, the more confident somebody is in their rating. Confidence is typically affected by how much you interact with somebody. So if I interact with you a lot, then my evaluation of your performance should count much higher than somebody who doesn't really know your work that much. But it's useful to get a spread, both of the types of roles that interact with an individual and also on the kind of depth is what I call it, but somebody more senior than you is somebody more junior than you in your same role. And so that way you kind of end up having a fairly balanced experience for everybody, having this combination of breadth and depth, right? And so what happens then is you have that the 360 assessment is not just developmental, it's not just what is good and what is bad, but it is actually quantitative. It is what level is this person performing at, and you can only do this well if you have very clear markers for each level. What does it mean to be a software engineer, a senior software engineer, lead software engineer, an engineering manager? Those have to be very clear, right? You have to have those very clear, and so we have very clear career ladders for each of our roles, because that allows us to then do this. It allows us to be aligned on hiring. It allows us to be aligned on development, because then it's clear what you need to do to get to the next level. Right, so that's number 1, and number 2 is the manager's decision. I just want to be clear, is still the primary decision. So the manager can kind of overrule the peers. But so the peers is not a substitute for the manager. You don't get a free pass as the manager and say, I just leave it to the peers. You still have to make a decision. Right? And then you have to explain the decision, but then it becomes much clearer where managers differ from peer ratings, and they have to make a very strong case to the calibration panel to say, actually, I differ, and here are all the reasons why I differ. And at the calibration panel, a sort of jury of their peers can actually overrule them. It can happen, but the manager's decision does, or the manager's proposed decision does carry quite a lot of weight. So that's the idea here. And then this is what I meant by the career ladders, right? So this career ladder for software engineers is kind of a prose paragraph that says, here's what this person is expected to do. Here's the impact that they're expected to create, because because competencies aren't always the best proxy for impact. You can have all the competencies in the world, but if you don't do anything with them, then that's not very valuable. Right? So we want to make sure that we're rewarding people based on impact and not just based on competencies, which is also what comes out in the performance paragraphs. And then finally, we do integrated teams. This is maybe slightly more relevant for larger organizations or government teams, but typically, as organizations grow, there are more and more papers and more policy. And people who are policymakers think of themselves often as they're the upstream people. They decide the policy and everything flows from that. But sometimes the technology actually should help determine what the policy is. And sometimes if the policy is theoretically good but cannot be implemented physically or technologically, then actually, is it a useful policy? I don't think so. So then the question is actually, how can you make sure this loop? Because by the time policy gets to product, it takes forever sometimes. And if the loop is not tight quickly from the product back to the policy, then you actually won't end up having good products or good policy. So specific example, actually, if you think about getting that whole vaccine.gov.sg set up, this is how it typically works. Actually, you got policy, you got ops, you got tech requirement, procurement, design, engineering, which takes months if you want to get here. And then from here, how the hell do you get back to policy? It's going to take ages. Right? And so we said, actually, let's just put all these people in the same room. Let's do it together. And then here's how you do it in 2 weeks exactly. Actually, you have here's the policy stuff, you draft it, you build a prototype, you test the prototype, you do some ops. Then you're like, hey, actually, this policy doesn't make sense. We need to change it. But your policy person is already there, right? So they already experience the user feedback and they understand what's happening. They're like, okay, we need to change this. Here are some of the risks. Management, you need to accept the risks. Okay, let's develop this product. Let's train everybody and then let's deploy. Right? That's how we built it in 2 weeks. We built it over Christmas and New Year's, actually. So that's the way that you can actually really accelerate product development. And finally, what are we doing next? Right? So the whole idea, like I said, is not just for us to experiment and implement, but really to persuade other people to also do similar things. And so we've worked with a bunch of different agencies in different ways. I have a very small team. There's only 3 of us right now. We're hiring, and so is all of OGP is hiring. I'll share the QR code if you're interested after this. But really, how do I then conserve my resources, right? I be very specific about the agencies that I work with that I want to invest a lot in. For the others, I either take a consulting approach and say, hey, make sure you do the work, but I'm here as a sounding board. And then for other people, I'm like, here are the guides. You go read this. You go do whatever you want with this. So that allows me to scale a lot without consuming a lot of resources. Specific example, I don't know if many of you know this, but the Singapore Armed Forces just they launched a 4th service. So besides the Navy, the Air Force, and the Army, there's a digital intelligence service. And so we help them hire because they're like, hey, with the Army, but we don't necessarily have the technical expertise to hire at sufficiently high levels of engineering capability. Can you help us design a process? So we did actually. We kind of helped them design both the interview process, but also the pre-selection process. And we helped them then have a very rigorous process where they wanted to be as stringent as possible. And so we managed to actually narrow down these 169 candidates into 23 offers, actually. So I'm really happy with that, because rather than have a lot of people in a new organization that's meant to be experimental who don't have the technological capabilities, which would be terrible, as a starting point, we made sure that actually the founding team would have the capabilities to actually launch and do really well. They're actually launching this Friday. That's when their parade is. Okay, cool. So that's it from me. You can go check out these guys if you want. There are individual guides, like 30 slides or more for each of these things. Feel free to go check them out. And also, we are hiring for a bunch of positions, both full-time and internships. So feel free to apply if you're interested. Cool. Thank you very much.